Hello, and welcome to the Poetry Universe. This podcast is intended to bridge the gap between the traditional literary world of poetry and the latest in cutting-edge social media platforms and web film technologies. I am Gil Rosado, your host and visual poet in residence. I recently spoke with Aaron Poochigian. He's a brilliant poet and translator. His 2017 hybrid verse novel, Mr. Either Or, is an excellent read. It's put out by Etruscan Press, and I highly recommend every one of my listeners and viewers get this book. It's available through Amazon or wherever books are sold. His latest work is a sequel to this in the same format. It's called Mr. Either Or, All the Rage, and it is scheduled to be released in June of this year. Please welcome Aaron Poochigian.
Oh, like a sneeze. Poochigian.
Okay, Aaron. Aaron has authored numerous books of original poetry and translations. Most recently, his translation of Euripides' The Bacchae, and one of my personal favorites, it's not of original poetry, is American Divine. His background is steeped in classics, yet with a contemporary spin. His latest work is his sequel to his 2017 avant-garde verse novel, Mr. Either Or, published by Etruscan Press. The links to this book and to Aaron's website are in the description below. Please welcome the poet extraordinaire, Aaron Poochigian.
Thank you very much for having me. I am excited to be in the poetry universe.
Aaron, first of all, so just before we begin, let me just read one excerpt from a review written by A.M. Juster from the back cover of the first Mr. Either Or, which is the novel the verse novel we're going to be talking about, as well as the sequel. So the review is: Aaron Poochigian's Mr. Either Or is the most significant verse novel since at least Vikram Seth's best-selling The Golden Gate of 3 decades ago. Although Poochigian's prosody and plotlines are more innovative than Seth's, a kaleidoscope of fusion of the masterful verse of Richard Wilbur and the hipster wryness of Douglas Adams. This book combines multiple genres, high culture with pop culture, grimness, and exuberance. It is a memorable, challenging, and entertaining read. I think that pretty much sums up a lot of this novel. It's a very astute or very correct, complete description. So for the listeners and all of us who are not familiar with the forms and history of verse novels, my understanding of such works, they have roots in ancient epic poems of Homer, Virgil, and Dante, as do many of our poems and novels, for that matter. However, the first noteworthy verse novel was Pushkin's Eugen Onegin, written in, or as the Russians would pronounce it, Yevgeny Onegin, written in 1831. Some other noteworthy works were the aforementioned Golden Gate and the autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. This genre, however, has not really been at the forefront of the poetic literary stage until the more recent renaissance of the young adult contemporary verse novels such as Elizabeth Acevedo's The Poet X. So, Aaron, when I read the first Mr. Either Or, I was a bit stunned at its effects, and I'll explain why. I found it not only to have a bold and broadly engaging spy story, but you achieved what I can only describe as a pseudo-cinematic cognitive effect on the reader. Now, that's my own term. So with this work, you included not only traditional poetic forms within a contemporary language/dialect, but you also weave them together to create a moving image type effect. Now, what I mean by that, I found it to be as if I were watching a movie. You do this most effectively at times by using tabular column lines, which makes the reader take in each linear excerpt as images. Um, this was, in my opinion, very ingenious and very effective for this kind of genre. Now, I could sit here and talk for hours about your wonderful book, but can you just tell us how you came to write Mr. Either Or?
I wanted, once I had given up all aspirations to become an academic or a tenured professor or anything like that, I decided just to be a writer, and I wanted to write a book in which I combined everything that I loved the most. And I wanted to do this by drawing both, as you mentioned, on classical epic, such as Homer's Odyssey, for example, and also on B movies, in particular from the 80s, that I liked very much, in order to um, create something that was, I hoped, at literary at the same time as having popular appeal, something that would have appeal outside of MFA programs and poetry and academia exclusively. It took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to present the material. I spent a year experimenting. I knew the story. I had storyboarded it all out. And it took me about a year to figure out how I wanted to present it and then how I wanted to write it. That first year when I was experimenting, I wanted the book to be a choose your own adventure book. You may or may be familiar with
Mm,
those, but they're a fun genre and they, in fact, anticipate a lot of early video
mm,
games. There's a New York writer, Tom Dish, who wrote an early 80s version of an online choose your own adventure book called Amnesia. It's in the second person, wake up with no memory in a hotel room in New York and have to reconstruct the past events that led you to be there. I found, however, when I would share the choose your own adventure version of the book with my readers and friends, that they didn't want to choose the options to go to page 13 if you want to go into the scary cave, or page 20 if you don't. They just wanted to read it straight through. And so I ended up tucking all the choice material into a through narrative. Also, you mentioned parallels with cinema. I wanted the music of the poetry to work like a soundtrack in a
mm,
film. I think most often of the fight scenes in the film The Matrix, where the dance music kicks in, and we're going to have a fun choreographed fight scene. And so I switch from the exposition poetry meter, which is iambic pentameter, which is free
mm,
rhymed. Everything rhymes, but in no particular pattern. To in the action scenes, to the meter of Beowulf. It's called alliterative verse, and it's set up in half lines, as you mentioned. And it does, depending on how you lay it out on the page, give that focus on each half line as not just a sonic, but also, as you mentioned, a visual whole, an image. And so I was able to give the book, I felt, a soundtrack, so that you get pounding 4-beat rhythms for the fight
mm.
scenes and then slow things down a little bit for the exposition.
That's very interesting when you mention the musical effects. I'm also, in addition to a writer, I'm also a musician and a composer. I'm kind of a call it an uber nerd when it comes to the arts. I also draw. So anyway, the point is that I'm trying to create these eclectic visual poems. So this is very interesting to me. Anything related to musical structures and musical rhythms, especially. Now, I've read some of the young adult verse novels out there. like the aforementioned The Poet X. But I think before I continue with talking about this book and your sequel, I have to ask, well, you have an extensive, I mean, tremendous classics background. And with your many poetry and other translations, I have to ask, are you going all in on the verse novel genre? And are you targeting a particular demographic in terms of adult market, young adult? What are you looking to do longer term with this type of format?
The audience, the intended audience for Mr. Either Or and Mr. Either Or All the Rage, the sequel that'll be coming out in June, yes, is the general reader, but I will be more specific, I promise. Certainly, because there are, again, we want to use the film analogy. Um, these books would be borderline PG-13 or rated R. There are certainly a fair number of cuss words, adult language, as it is called, and there is a fair amount of graphic violence. I want the books to be not a reflect as Homer's Iliad was a reflection of his culture. I want these books to be a reflection of contemporary American culture. And in just that way, then, it's not a particularly flattering image of the United States of America, our culture, but there it is, right? And so the book is very accepting in portraying graphic violence, right? However, like American culture, it is very prudish when portraying sex,
Mm.
right? And so basically, you can blow 500 guys away and the film's still PG-13, but one breast and it's rated R. Welcome to American culture. And so it's simultaneously a reflection of our culture and a parody of it, I would like to think.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good depiction of it. So you're basically sticking to it's geared for adults, but anything above PG-13 and somewhere it's between PG-13 and R, if you were making the analogy to movie ratings. So that's interesting. It's like that. Like I said, I saw it, I read
Well,
it, I thought this is great for adults, and it's really I think you have something here like that could catch on. All right, you mentioned you're going to be releasing the sequel to this work in June. I guess where do you see the main character going in the sequel? Much of the novel, as you know, is in this contemporary. It's even hard for me to just to put a label on it, as some of the other reviewers said, because you're mixing in a lot of references to ancient epics and ancient um, even you have a lot in here from many centuries ago. Yet it's rolled up into a palette of contemporary
uh,
dialect, for lack of a better
yes.
terminology.
And when I first started writing it in the second person, I also conceived of it as an escape. As we often think of action films. And so, though certainly intended for adults, it is, well, in terms of its what general tenor, often juvenile. And so, in the sequel that's coming out, Mr. Either Or All the Rage, our hero, Mr. Either Or, is forced to grow up somewhat reluctantly. The love interest, Li Ling Levine, who is an art curator at the Met Museum, they stay together and are living together at the beginning of Mr. Either Or All the Rage when they begin their next adventure. And there is a hurricane descending on New York City that's going to force the entire city to be evacuated. And there's all that pressure as, yes, an evil villain is planning to take advantage of the empty city in order to steal some computer technology from the Department of Homeland Security. But the major point is, you're with Li Ling, and it turns out that she has missed a period. It is clear that she very well may be pregnant. And as the hurricane moves in, all of these adult anxieties having to do with fatherhood come to haunt Mr. Either Or as he deals with that next criminal. Um, the fourth and final episode, the second half of Mr. Either Or, brings back around, I'd like to think, in a sort of ring composition, the focus on, yes, ancient Chinese literature and culture. And so, in that fourth episode, set about a year after the first, a child has been born, and Mr. Either Or has attempted to get out of the business, to quit working for the FBI. And he's a stay at home dad. But he does end up being pulled back into, yes, adventures and having to save the world. And this is all bound up in that book, as there was the anxiety over the pregnancy in the first episode. Excuse me. In the second episode, there's all this anxiety over sleep training the infant,
Hmm.
ferberizing, it's called, right?
Yeah.
Where you let the baby cry itself to sleep. And I know, spoiler alert, at a climactic moment after a major gunfight in his apartment, the baby does simply just cry itself to sleep and goes to sleep for the first time on its own. And there is, yes, all is right in the universe. And At the very end of the second book, Mr. Either Or, yes, our hero realizes that it's his maturation that these four episodes and two books have been about. He reflects on this as he's looking at his daughter, who's slowly starting to become a toddler.
Yeah. This is a very contemporary story, as you described, and I think will resonate with our current readership. Let's say, are you looking to expand into the fiction market with this? Because this is kind of a hybrid crossover verse novel, obviously. Have you thought about the I hate to make it sound more business-like, but has this? I mean, we talked about, this is geared towards adults, but is this really the market that actually is interested in reading spy novels, this type of thrillers, that type of thing? Because I think it does appeal to that crowd. It does demand more from the reader, but I think we have a. So anyway, are you looking in this type of? Do these thoughts come to your mind in terms of the market for these types of books?
Certainly they do. And I'm
Hmm.
comfortable talking about
Hmm.
the literary market and the poetry market. It's always an active debate in my mind. Yes, I will, in addition to the publicity that the press provides, I will hire an outside publicist that will try to promote it alongside major thrillers by like Lee Child, for example, or James Patterson. We'll see how well we do. I'll also try to have the book optioned to be turned into a film as well, as one commonly does with thrillers. But yes, I like to be very aware of the contemporary audience, and I want to satisfy and not alienate the contemporary audience, right? A lot of our contemporary readers are uncomfortable with poetry, and it's mostly poetry's fault, right? In that it is alienating and distancing and recondite and hermetic. And it's like only members of a secret society get to understand that. I want to destroy all of
Thank you.
that and make poetry.
That's exactly
Yes,
my
and
that's
make
my objective as
poetry.
well. Because yeah,
Yes, tear
and
it
I
all
also
down.
think I had a professor years ago, and I strongly disagree with this. But he would say we're writing for our own tribe. which it's true. That's the way it currently is, but that's not the way it should be because this wasn't the way in previous centuries. It was accessible to everyone, and it is complicated to understand poetry in many ways, depending on what kind of poems we're dealing with, and the more leaning towards the classics you go today. The readership of classics is not as high as it once was. As obviously, I love classics. I'm a big ancient epic poetry fanatic, and the older the poems, usually the more I like them. But I also am trying to build a bridge between the not only that type of literature, but using some of the structures of current literature as well as social media technologies. And that's where I'm going with this because right now, you and I both know there's even forgetting about poetry altogether, the percentage of adults who actually read in this country voluntarily and as well as globally is around, and this might surprise people. When I read the statistics and the global statistics on this, I was a little surprised because I've always been a reading fanatic, but only about 30 to 35% of the adult population that can read actually does so voluntarily. So think about that for a moment. Then you further reduce the population of readers by the poetry readers. But, however, we have some tools available to us. Not only are these hybrid novels excellent for building readership, but I do think that we do need to capitalize, as you mentioned, on both the mainstream media, such as films, documentaries, and social media. So, the more we can get our messages out there, the more audience we'll have, the more readership we'll have, the bigger audience we'll have. So, I like the fact that you're thinking cinematically about this a lot. Um, and I think that's where the market and the poetry world should go. This is a very stubborn market, however. There are still people who just want to focus on the niche market for quote unquote writing for our tribe. I don't know if this will change, but I am trying to change it on my end. And I think you are, by doing these works, doing the same thing. Now, you do have an extensive classics background in translations. And before we finish this podcast today, I'd like to ask you about those projects. If you could just talk about briefly about your classics background and what led you to going in this direction, and maybe with the Bakai, which is very popular. And it was very well written. I never emailed you before about that, but I thought that was great. Um, anyway, if you could just talk a little bit about your translations and
I I only got into literary translation, as we call it, um, in order, well, as exercises for my
mhm,
original work. I was in graduate school for classics, and I only wanted to be a poet, but I also had to do, well, scholarly sorts of things. And as practice for that, I would do translations that were not just cribs, but I would polish them with the intention of publishing
mhm,
them. And that interest, that craft exercise, if you will, grew into a very modest way of supplementing my income, in that I've, yes, published a fair number of literary translations now. Euripides Bacchae, that translation was special in that it was commissioned by a theater company in New York called City, SITI, for a production first at the Getty Villa in Malibu, and then at BAM, the Brooklyn
mhm,
Academy of Music in Brooklyn, and then at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. I had worked with them before on a different project in translation. And so I had started it before and had then about 2 months to complete it and polish it. And I worked nonstop on it. And it's different from my other translations, in that. when I was translating it, I translated it with the stage in mind, rather than the page in mind. Stage
Very good
versus
term.
page is a common distinction in translating plays. So, with a translation for the page, then again, I want to bring everything up into the text so that the translation stands on its own as a work of art. That is, I want to have as few notes, whether they're end notes or yes, bottom of the page notes, footnotes, as possible. But when you're translating for the stage, you can't, even when you need to, have any footnotes or endnotes. And so it has to not only have all the content up in the words the actors are saying, the text has to be understandable on a first hearing as opposed to a first reading or a second reading or a third reading. So I had a different objective with that one, and I'm happy with how it turned out. I was afraid as part of that process that I was going to have to simplify things. I didn't want to dumb down Euripides for a contemporary theater audience. I didn't want to be patronizing in that way, and I was happy that with lots of revisions, I felt I was able to get the original meanings and complexity into the play in a way that was comprehensible, digestible to an audience on a first hearing.
Very good. Words for the stage, not the page. Words of wisdom. I would like to once again thank Aaron Poochigian for joining me on the Poetry Universe, and I would like to really thank all of you for watching and listening to this video podcast. I'll be leaving all of Aaron's links in the description below, and I invite all of you to subscribe to my channel and to be on the lookout for future podcasts. Thank you.